All right, hi everybody. Let's continue on with, I think, what will be our last portion of the plant lecture as we talk about plant ecology and ecology in general. So let's get started. And we'll start with a simple, why are plants important? Plants often don't get the credit they deserve, but when you really think about it, plants are significantly important. First of all, one very basic thing, plants serve as food for nearly the entire planet in one way or another. When I was in college, and if you watch some of the older videos from the 1960s, 70s, and maybe even early 1980s, they make statements that basically all of life runs on energy that comes from the sun and then through photosynthesis in plants. And since then, we found that's not exactly 100% true, pretty close. There are a couple small ecosystems here and there at the bottom of the ocean and so forth that don't rely on plants and photosynthesis. But with those small exceptions, nearly all of life, the food for humans and everything else comes from photosynthesis mainly, and plants in one form or another, directly or indirectly. It goes from the sun to the plants. And as humans, we've been growing plants a very long time. We've been growing plants and domesticating plants for about 13,000 years. So for a long period of time, being able to farm and control and grow crops has allowed humans to survive in periods of time when maybe they couldn't. So that's significant. If you look at what we grow in the world, although there's some 250,000 plants, I'm sort of guessing. I always add to my number as time goes on. My sort of memory is that it's 220,000. So if you add a little bit more, assuming they find and discover more plants, we're probably around 250,000 number of species of plants, 250,000 or so. But out of all the plants that are possible, we really get 80% of all our calories, at least in humans, from 6 crops: wheat, rice, maize, which is like corn, potatoes. Remember, potatoes are a modified stem. Cassava, which is another root, like sweet potatoes. So remember, sweet potatoes, cassava, and yams are modified roots, whereas a potato is a modified stem. So although we can grow a wide range of plants, and many of them are edible in one form or another, we tend to grow not very many crops, unfortunately. I think this has a lot to do with human sort of expectation of what they like, and we develop preferences. But that's really a bad choice to put all of your effort into that 80%, because throughout history, Irish potato famine, for example, there are times when a pathogen of some sort can damage or hurt one of your crops. And if you rely with 80% of your calories coming from only 6 crops, you're kind of setting yourself up for bad things to happen. So hopefully over time we change that and lessen that number. Okay. Also, people, I think most people, at least Bio 2 students get this, but even if you don't eat plants and you eat cattle or some other kind of animal, you got to keep in mind that in order to have that animal, they have to eat plants. So the plants are important whether you eat the plants or not. If you just eat animals, which wouldn't be very good for you, I wouldn't think, health-wise, those animals have to eat the plants. And I'll show you this in the next picture. And you probably know this already from Bio 1 or Bio 4. But let's say you're going to, grow or eat cattle and beef and that sort of thing. It takes roughly 5 to 7 kilograms or so to make 1 kilogram of beef. And in part, the reason that is something you should have learned in Bio 1 and or Bio 4 that we often forget, and it is one of the laws of thermodynamics. It's called the second, I don't know if it's not tertiary, it's not that. It's the secondary law of thermodynamics, and that is often also described in the term of entropy, always increasing. And entropy, remember, is disorder, how disordered the energy is. So in a nutshell, when the sun hits the earth and shines, it hits the plants, that energy in the sun, plants do photosynthesis, and they use the sunlight and carbon dioxide to convert that energy in light energy into chemical energy. And so if you had, let's say, 1,000,000 joules of energy, you would get roughly 10,000 joules of energy into the plant. And the reason for that is because, like I said, second law of thermodynamics, every time you transfer or move energy from one state to another, it's never 100% efficient. You're always losing some of it. And because you're always losing some of it, that the second law of thermodynamics means that you can't ever grab all the energy as you transfer it. We're always trying to improve, say, car efficiency and things of that sort, but you can't ever transfer all the energy from one place to another without losing some of it at least. Okay? Unless something has changed in the world of physics that is beyond my understanding, but in general, that's the second law of thermodynamics. And therefore, when you are, let's say, a grasshopper, and then the grasshoppers are eating the plants, same thing. As they eat that, the amount of energy they can gain from that is reduced. And it's reduced by quite a bit. It's somewhere in the neighborhood, depending on the organism and whatnot, of like 80 or 90% of the energy is lost. So if you are a human and you're eating, say, the cow instead of the grasshopper, and that ate that, basically there's very little energy up at the top. The higher you eat up in the food pyramid, the less energy there is, because there's always a loss of energy because of that second law of thermodynamics. The other thing that plants do that is significant is they remove carbon dioxide from the air. Hopefully you know that we have some climate change issues. Let's put it that way, let's say. And there's a lot of, it's a complex thing, climate change. Many, many years ago, they just called it global warming. And although global warming is still valid here and there, really the bigger picture of it is climate change. And it seems as of now, we're in this COVID-19 pandemic, like world shutdown right now. So I don't know what this date is going to show, but I think it's going to be interesting. But anyway, today I think is 4/8/2020. And my point of that is, as of about now, I'm seeing that even politicians seem to start accepting that there's these climate change issues. I say that because that was always sort of not true. Scientists have been kind of talking about this since 1950 or maybe even earlier, but it's been in the mainstream scientific community, I'd say, since the 1980s and 90s. When I was a student, this was pretty well established among the scientific community. And then you had all the experts in the media and politicians and so forth going, well, maybe this and that. But my point is, even politicians seem to at least pretty much agree there's something going on here. Now, again, it's complex, and we won't go into all the complexity about it. It's interesting, but plants, one of the things they do is they remove CO2. And so if you look at a graph of the temperature of the Earth, you can see that it's going up and it's going down, and it's kind of hopping all over the place. And that's one of the things, unfortunately, that the non-scientific people see is, well, how can you say that the temperature of the Earth is changing, for example, when the graph clearly shows all these ups and downs, which is unfortunate. But imagine this is your grade, okay? Let's say we're taking a quiz every week. And I said, hey, how do you think you're doing in class? Is this going okay? Is this good? Are you heading in the right direction? If this is your grade? And hopefully you would go, well, I have some ups and downs, but you can clearly kind of see if I do what's called a line of best fit, somewhere in here like this, I'm kind of heading in the right direction, hopefully. Okay? Hopefully. And it's interesting that this is your temperature variation. And if you look, I use this example, I just noticed this, but if this is your grade and you're doing this, you notice you're kind of aiming right around the A mark at 90%. That's just kind of luck. But anyway, the red that you see here is temperature going up and down, but you also have a good measurement of CO2 in black. And one of the things also that's confusing is you'll see that the CO2 level is going up and down over time. And there's a very good reason for that. In fact, it turns out there's an up and a down every year. And we'll get into this in a little bit in a second. But because of the tilt of the Earth, we have seasons. And it turns out that as of now, in the last many millions of years, most of the land is in the northern hemisphere. And because most of the land is in the northern hemisphere, you have more trees and plants and things of that sort. So when it is spring and summer in the northern hemisphere, there's more photosynthesis, and that drives that down. And then when it's winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere, the CO2 level kind of goes back up again a little bit. And that cycles all the time. And that's why there's an up and down every year for that. And that probably affects the temperature somewhat too as it goes. But again, you can clearly see CO2 levels and temperature clearly going up. But I think it's going to be interesting with this worldwide sort of shutdown with many less people driving, all kinds of things of that sort. Will we look back, and hopefully someone's doing it, capturing the CO2 data to see what ends up happening, but people are not traveling by plane as much and all kinds of things. And I think we're going to see, I hope, but the data will show us if that has a big impact on climate change, and can we measure that or not. Okay. The other reason plants are important is for us, unfortunately, you're always trying to convince people of these kind of things, such as in rainforest plants. But currently, about 25% of all prescription drugs in the United States have one or more active ingredients in plants. They come from plants. You don't have to memorize this list here. I'll tell you about a couple of them. Interestingly, this quinine and a derivative of that, hydroquinine, is currently being discussed as it's been used for a long time to treat malaria, but now they're like, maybe this can be used to treat this COVID-19 infection. That's the politicians saying it, and there's some anecdotal evidence of people taking it and feeling better. But as of now, the scientific community is like, wait a minute, we don't know. There's these long-term trials that usually they do. And it seems when I get on Facebook, which I quickly get off because it just makes me mad, because I find all these experts on COVID-19. In general, to be a professional expert on something, you're supposed to put in 2,000 hours of studying that one thing. Then you're an expert. As of now, in April, the COVID-19 virus, being a novel virus, it's only been around 4 months. So how we're suddenly having all these experts is not possible. So even the experts would say, I think, and I've heard them say, we don't know yet. And they're basing it on their tremendous knowledge of things like it. But anyway, many of the politicians are saying this might work. They might be right. They might be wrong. But anyway, I'll talk about those in a couple. So you don't have to memorize this whole list, but I'll tell you about a couple of them on the next couple slides. The other thing is that you can sort of put together that pharmaceuticals and the treatment and modern medicine should be important, you would think. Our survival as modern humans in this world, and the use of technology and all these things that make life easier and better for us in places like the United States. One of those things being medicine, to be able to treat things that happen. And so if 25% of all prescription drugs contain some ingredient from plants, you would hope that plants are important. But we are currently wiping out many species of things on the planet. 50%. I have up here, I got this from somewhere, and I don't think this one's right. I'm going to guess and go, I don't think that's quite right. But if you look at the number of species that are going extinct right now and calculate the ability for new species being formed, which people do, it's a difficult math model. I have a friend, though, that's good at this kind of thing, and I'm going to ask him about this later. Get to that. But anyway, the idea is that we're losing probably around 50% of the species are going to be coming extinct in the next 100 years, probably even sooner than that. So in the last 100 years, it appears that we're wiping out about 50% of the species on planet Earth, which is about the same as the Cretaceous extinction, which wiped out most of the dinosaurs, but we'll find out not all the dinosaurs, because dinosaurs aren't quite what you think they are. But in general, you're right. So 65 million years ago, we have pretty good evidence that a meteorite thing, there might be a better term for it, hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, created a big cloud of dust, sulfuric acid, blocked out sunlight, sulfuric acid, and changed the climate very, very quickly. And that wiped out the dinosaurs and a bunch of other things. In the Cretaceous extinction, that wiped out 50% of things on Earth. So what we're doing as humans in terms of development and so forth is kind of like the Cretaceous extinction. Now, somewhere in a book I came across, so I put it in here, that it's larger than the Permian extinction, which my knowledge of that's around 90%. So I think that's a little bit much. So I cross it out. I have it in there because I got it from a source that's probably pretty good, but my recollection is that's a good number, but in 7 or 8 or other textbooks, I think that's pushing it. Okay. So certainly Cretaceous, that seems to be right. And we've only studied about 5,000 of the 290,000 species. So remember, I said I keep adding to that number. And I think I said 220 before, and then I jumped to 250. And so when I made this, I said around 290, because we're always discovering and naming new plant species. So it's not so much that there are new ones, which people think, oh, well, wait, we're getting all these new ones. No, we're naming new ones as we discover them. So they're not evolving necessarily at that rate. We just are way behind on what we name sometimes. So anyway, if you do that math, the point is we know and have studied chemical properties of only a small portion. And that should be of concern because maybe there are cures for all kinds of things like COVID-19, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, many things could be there and we just don't know yet. And so if you break that down, if you look at how quick things are going extinct, by the time we get to this part in today's lecture, I'm guessing I went about 15 minutes so far, we've probably lost one thing already. So it's about 3 or 4 species per hour. So we're losing about, as an estimate, 27,000 species per year going extinct. Now, which is a big number. That's how you get to that 50% so quickly. And then people wonder how bad or devastating that could be. So 3 or 4 species per hour. So to put that in perspective, let's say you had all the humans in the world and all the humans, for whatever reason, everybody died at one time. That'd be 1, because humans are 1 species. Although there's a lot of us, and we're large in size, and there's a lot of us, that'd be 1. If all the elephants went extinct, and there are different species of elephants, but if all of one kind of elephant went extinct, that'd be 1. So the way you get to that number, most of these things are small and the populations of them are very tiny, and they live like on a tree or two in a tropical rainforest. And once you cut the tree down, you tend to lose those 2 or 3 insect species mainly that live there. So that's how you're getting that number. But again, it's happening rapidly. So some of the plants that are used to treat are used as medications. One is from this plant called the cinchona tree. You're hearing this about this on the news right now. It's actually been around a long time, since the 1600s. And I think they patented it as a drug in the 1930s, but those patents were out, and now there are what do you call those? Generic versions of the drug now. So a bunch of companies make quinine derivatives of that, but it comes from the bark of this cinchona tree, and it grows in the Andes in Peru, and they've used it for a long time as one of the early treatments for malaria, which is still a worldwide big killer. Remember malaria? What causes malaria? Do we remember? It starts with a P. Does your brain still, are you thinking about it? Plasmodium causes malaria. Okay. Also, aspirin, regular over-the-counter aspirin. If you have a headache, or people take it now quite often to help prevent heart attacks and things like that, baby aspirin. There's a bit of debate on that. I've talked to several doctors about that, but anyway, that's irrelevant. But it's interesting. Anyway, aspirin comes from the bark of many different kinds of plants, but mainly willow trees. So aspirin, originally, the willow trees have in it a chemical called a salicylic acid. Or they abbreviate ASA, and that's been used for a long time. The Greek physician Hippocrates prescribed it. It's been used as a drug since about 3000 BC. So you're talking about, this is a 5,000-year-old drug. And they would just, you don't have it in a pill, of course, but they chew on the bark and things like that. And in 1899, so also a long time ago, the Bayer company bought that patent and named it aspirin. And I don't know all the law behind it, but essentially, when you have a certain amount of time to own the drug name, Bayer essentially owns the actual name of aspirin, but you can get non-Bayer versions of it because a lot of companies can make it. after a certain amount of time. My recollection is something like 7 years or 8 years or something like that. That might have changed over the years, but when a company has a new drug, they get to exclusively sell it for a certain amount of time. But the name aspirin actually is not just a general name, but it's actually from Bayer, the company. Okay. Now, a little bit about ecology now and how that affects plant and plant growth and where we are in the world. So you should all know, hopefully, that the Earth is going around the sun. And it takes 1 year for the Earth to go all the way around the sun, about 365 days. In addition to that circular rotation, the Earth is also spinning on its own axis. And so the Earth, like if I take it over here like this, the Earth, let's see, how am I going to do this? Summer solstice. Yeah, I'm going to do it like this. Go away, pen. I'm going to do it like that. It's not very straight. So if this is straight up and down, there's this little tilt. The Earth is tilted. And that tilt is, my understanding, it changes throughout the history of time, but it's at about 23.5 degrees right now. And over millions of years, I think there's some slight change to it. But there's a tilt to it, and it takes 24 hours for the Earth to go around on its own axis. So there's two kinds of spinning going on. There's the Earth going around on its own axis, and then it's also going around the sun, which takes about a year. Now, because of that tilt, the light that is hitting the Earth hits it at a slightly different angle at different times of the year. And that's what gives us our seasons. So if I go back to this and I have this 23.5 degree tilt, if the sun is shining on it and the Earth has a tilt to it as the rays come and hit the sun, because of the tilt, you have slightly more rays that are able to hit the sun there, and because of the tilt, less of them are hitting there. And that means when we're in our summer in June, the summer solstice, which is about June 20th or 21st, that's when you have like the longest day, and you have the actual start of summer because of the tilt. And going up to that point, the days are getting longer. Right now, when I'm making this lecture, we're at April 8th, I think, somewhere in there. So we're going this way, and we're on our way to summer. And then after summer, we'll go into September and so forth. But at this particular time, the days are getting longer because we are tilted at 23.5 degrees right now, that direction. Now, because of that, you get differential heating. So as the sun, if you shined a light down like the sun does, it hits the Earth, and because it's round, it sort of spreads out. And so in the north and south poles, there's less and less and less light because the rays travel over a larger area. So you get most consistent light, about 12 hours and 12 hours of day, dark, right at the equator. And what happens when you get the sun shining down is it warms up the air here, and warm air rises like that. And when the warm air rises and cools, it drops the rain. One of the little jokes I like to make is I tell people, okay, let's say you're up in an airplane there, and you open the door of the airplane. Is it hot or cold? And people usually know intuitively it's cold up there for whatever reason. But then I go, well, wait, aren't you closer to the sun? So if you're closer to the sun, shouldn't it be warmer? And it always creates a great source of confusion because you can see it in everyone's eyes like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Well, these pictures are always drawn to get a simple message across. Reality is this sun is like 98 million miles away or something like that. So it's very, very far. So although the sun does shine down on it, this small distance you would travel on an airplane at 30, 40, 50,000 feet doesn't really get you that much closer to the sun. So what happens is the pressure is low up here because you have all these molecules stacking up, pushing down. So when you're on the Earth, the pressure's high. The higher you go up on a mountain or in a plane, pressure's lower, and it makes the temperature drop. So when the temperature drops, the water molecules stick together, and that creates rain. So what you find is in this belt here, 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator, you get tropical rainforests. We call these types of air movements Hadley cells. So at the equator, you have this warm air, and it's rising, and as it cools, it would sink, but it's being pushed by warm air that's rising there, and so it really doesn't come down till at around, so it makes this cycle like that. And so because it's being pushed by the other rising air, it tends to sink at 30 degrees north and south of the equator, and it goes, some of it goes that way, some of it goes this way. But what you end up with is in that belt in there, you get your tropical rain forest, or lots of rain in those tropical regions, because the daylight's consistent and the rainfall tends to be consistent. Now, since you're dropping all the rain here, that means at 30 degrees north of the equator, you have this very dry descending air, and that's where you end up getting deserts. And then you get different biomes as you go this way. I like to just call them all Hadley cells. There are different names for each one, but in general, let's just call them Hadley cells. And that's happening all over the Earth in both the north and the south hemisphere. So if I'm at the equator here, I have Hadley cells doing that, and then doing that all over the Earth. Okay, so now you have the Earth spinning, you have this differential heating, and you have these Hadley cells where the air is rising and then being displaced and sinking. So you got tropical forests at around 0 degrees and at 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator. That's where you have your tropical forests, as I mentioned. And then at 30 degrees, the air drops down and you have your deserts. So you tend to have deserts right across this region right there. Now, because you have those, and because you have the wind, or because you have the Hadley cells, and because you have the Earth spinning, you end up with wind patterns that are changing directions depending on where you are on the Earth. And that spinning creates, in addition to the wind, creates what's called the Coriolis effect. I'm going to explain it, and then what you're going to find is you're going to want to probably memorize this. I generally, for me, I don't like to just memorize things. I try to understand it because then it makes sense. But you're going to struggle maybe with this. And so it's helpful on a quiz situation to also memorize it. But anyway, objects appear to be deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere. So if I'm in the northern hemisphere, which is up here, which is where you live, let's say I live right here. Okay. If I were to shoot a rocket at Canada, let's say, okay, somewhere up here. Well, let's do it from, let's say there's a little island right here. The Galapagos Islands are probably not terribly far from there, but let's say they launch an attack on Canada, okay? And if I shoot my rocket, what's going to happen is, although I might, aim it that way, what'll happen, and since we're making this YouTube video and sending out, it's a rocket with money in it. So this isn't a war attack. This is like, we're helping the people in Minnesota or whatever it is. Okay. Anyway, we shoot some kind of thing that's meant to be useful towards them. And it's traveling along like this, but actually it starts to do that. It's deflected towards the right. And the reason, well, we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so let's say I'm up here and they want to return the favor and they want to shoot their rocket of the money or resources back to us, and they shoot it. What will happen is it will also be deflected towards the right, which means it will do that. And you might be thinking, that looks like it's to the left, but you got to think about it in terms of the path at which it's taking relative to the object. So if you were the missile going this way, the missile or the rocket is traveling towards its right. Does that make sense? Okay, southern hemisphere is the opposite of that, and in the southern hemisphere things are deflected towards the left. So if I'm in my southern hemisphere, or if I'm going to shoot something towards my southern hemisphere, and it's going to travel this way, okay, it's going to go to its left like that. Okay, if I'm shooting it from here, southern hemisphere, it's going to go to its left. Okay, so first thing to do, memorize that. Coriolis effect on the Earth, objects appear to be deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. Now, just as a quick explanation, and then you can think about it all day if you want, you have the Earth, which is pretty round, right? And the amount of time it takes, if you're here on the equator, to go all the way around one time of daylight, that's 24 hours, right? If you're way up here in the north, it takes, to go around one time, because it's a ball, it's turning, takes 24 hours also, right? Now, because of that, because it takes the same amount of time in both scenarios, you got to think about the equator, their circumference all the way around it is far bigger than it is way up in the north, but they take the same amount of time to go around one time. And so if two things are going to travel the same amount of time, but one's going to go a lot further, then that one has to travel a lot faster. So when this is spinning, the equator is turning much faster than this part. So when you shoot your rocket, it is not only going that way, but it has an initial speed and velocity going this way also, because it's spinning. Same thing's true down here. When I shoot it this way, it has a velocity that is traveling this way also, right? So it's traveling faster on the equator than it is down here. So when the rocket takes off and you're shooting it straight, it takes, because it's going so fast that way, there's a drag for this to catch up. It's slower. So it looks like it goes like that. Okay? So same thing up here. Wait, did I do that right? I went from, what did I do? Oh no, that's why I did it here. So if I shoot it this way and go like that, right? So I'm in the southern hemisphere, it's going to be deflected towards the left. This is traveling very slow. So it's barely, it's going slow relative to this. So by the time I shoot this, this is going to catch up. It's going to be moving so fast that it's going to look like it lands over there, like that. Okay? Coriolis effect. Take a basketball, spin it around. Again, the middle of the basketball has to travel faster than the top of the basketball because it takes the same amount of time for them to go around, and the basketball in the center is bigger, so there you go. It's simple math after that. Okay. Now, because of that differential heating, we have different ecological systems in different spots. So at the equator at 0 degrees and between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn in that belt. So in Central America, parts of Africa, Northern Australia, India, and parts of Asia and South America, those are all sort of tropical regions. The Tropic of Cancer is at 23.5 degrees north of the equator. Tropic of Capricorn, is at 23.5 degrees south of the equator. And then you have your 30-degree belt in here where you also have your deserts that we mentioned. So there are different biomes, which are large habitats based on temperature and plant vegetation that you can see throughout the globe based on that differential heating of the earth. So you should study this map and basically know where these particular biomes are. I'll talk about a couple of them as we go. In addition to that, we have ocean biomes, and normally we would be taking our intertidal trip, but we have the COVID-19 outbreak right now, so we don't know what's going to happen. But in the intertidal zone, we have lots of animal diversity because you have this change in water depth and salinity and temperature. So there's a great number of organisms that live here. And if you go out on the continental shelf, that zone from shore, open ocean, to continental shelf where it's still fairly shallow, maybe under 1,000 meters or so, which is deep for a person, but not as deep as the ocean. That's called the neritic zone. That's where most of the nutrients are. And if you go past that, where it gets suddenly very deep, that's called the oceanic zone. Because you have water, light tends to only penetrate to a certain distance at about 1,000 meters. So all of that is called the photic zone. And if you want to break down the photic zone and then everything below that, you see most of the ocean is aphotic. There's no light. And anytime you're on the bottom, that's called the benthic zone. Benthic zone can be at the bottom of the ocean, which is how we often refer to it. But there are animals that live in fairly shallow water, but in the soil, that are also benthic organisms. So most of the ocean, benthic, is very deep water, very, very deep and hard to get to. But we'll talk about benthic organisms that live in the sand here, certain kinds of worms and things of that sort that are really not in all that deep of water. And then anytime you're out in deep water, whether you're in the photic zone or aphotic zone, that whole region, which is the largest portion by volume, is called the pelagic zone. And then the very bottom of the benthic zone is the abyssal zone, which is we're always learning new things about, which is interesting. Now, we're going to cross this need to know here part now because we've already talked about this, but hopefully at this point you have mastered the geological timescale. We're going to use this in pretty much every, it could come up in any quiz, practicum, or anything that we have left moving forward on the final exam for sure. The beauty of the geological timescale is it doesn't change really. It's been around for a long period of time and it's pretty consistent. Again, people come up with acronyms. One of my friends and colleagues calls this one Peter Pan Must Cry. Is that what it is? But you got to make sure you do it in the right order. I have students come up and they're all mad because they're like, hey, I memorized the thing and I don't see this is not working out because they do it backwards like that. So however you do it, just make sure you know what you're doing. That's true in like a lot of things. So Cenozoic is newer, and then Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Precambrian are a long time ago. They're further away in time. So whether you start this way or you start down here doesn't matter really in your saying or your naming or your learning, but just make sure that however you've done it, that you know that these are recent times. These happened not so long ago, and these all happened a long time ago. Okay? I hope everyone's doing well, and that's the end of plants and ecology. And the next thing coming up we get to move into is animals. And I think that what I find is most people, things get better. The next information coming up is challenging because there's so much of it. But I think you're going to like the fact that as we move into animals and we talk about a lobster, for example, you at least know what a lobster is. Or we talk about a pill bug roly-poly, or we talk about a grasshopper or a butterfly. Although you have a lot to learn, I think you're going to like the fact that there are things that you already kind of know, and you have a language and an idea developed since you were a kid about these things. And so although there's a lot of it, I'm confident that I think we're getting into the parts where students tend to do better in Bio 2. It gets harder because there's more information, but what I find is the students tend to get better as we pass through plants. And particularly when we get into mammals and birds, people usually do very well. Okay, have a good day.